The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and orange as Thomas Mitchell stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 62, he had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical, but none had prepared him for what this particular Tuesday would bring to his doorstep. Thomas owned 300 acres of rolling pasture land nestled between the Rockies and endless plains. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, black dots against the amber grass that swayed in the gentle morning breeze. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather, who had settled here in 1923. Thomas had inherited not just the land, but also the values that came with it: hard work, self-reliance, and a deep respect for the solitude that the vast Montana landscape provided. His wife Sarah had passed away 4 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Their only son, Michael, lived in Seattle with his own family, visiting maybe twice a year when his busy career as a software engineer allowed. Thomas didn't hold it against him. The city had its pull, and ranch life wasn't for everyone. But for Thomas, there was nowhere else he'd rather be. The ranch house itself was a modest 2-story structure built in the 1940s. Thomas had maintained it well over the years, replacing the roof, updating the plumbing, and adding modern conveniences while preserving its rustic charm. The wraparound porch faced east, giving him perfect views of the sunrise each morning. Behind the house sat a large red barn, a chicken coop, and a workshop where Thomas spent his evenings repairing equipment or working on woodworking projects. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Wake at 5, tend to the animals, check the fences, maintain the equipment, and handle the countless small tasks that keep a ranch running. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors before retiring early. Weekends brought trips to town for supplies and the occasional dinner at Murphy's Diner, where he'd catch up with a few neighbors scattered across the vast county. Thomas had grown comfortable with his solitude. After Sarah's death, well-meaning friends had suggested he might want to move closer to town, maybe find a smaller place that would be easier to manage. But the ranch was more than just property to him. It was his anchor, his identity, his sanctuary. The silence that others found unsettling was music to his ears. The space that intimidated visitors felt like freedom. He had learned to appreciate the subtle changes in seasons that city dwellers might miss. The way the light shifted throughout the year, how the wind carried different scents depending on the weather, the migration patterns of birds that stopped by his pond. These observations filled his days with quiet wonder that no television program or social gathering could match. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and Thomas preferred it that way. He wasn't antisocial, exactly, but he had little patience for small talk or drama. His interactions were purposeful: business with feed suppliers, conversations with the veterinarian, or the occasional chat with Bill Henderson, whose ranch bordered his southern property line. These interactions satisfied his need for human contact without overwhelming his preference for peace. Thomas had always been what people called set in his ways. He liked his coffee black, his eggs over easy, and his news delivered by radio rather than television. He didn't own a computer and saw no need for one. His flip phone served him fine for the few calls he needed to make. The world was changing rapidly around him, but here on the ranch, time moved at a pace he could understand and control. Financial concerns weren't keeping him awake at night. The ranch was profitable enough, and his needs were simple. He raised some cattle for market, kept a few horses, and maintained a large vegetable garden that supplied most of his food needs. His expenses were minimal: fuel for the trucks and equipment, feed supplements, occasional veterinary bills, and basic utilities. The mortgage had been paid off decades ago, and property taxes remained reasonable in rural Montana. This particular morning felt no different from any other as Thomas finished his coffee and headed to the barn. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and he made a mental note to check the heating system in the barn before the first hard freeze. His border collie, Rex, trotted alongside him, alert for any signs of trouble among the livestock. The cattle were gathered near the water tank, their breath creating small clouds in the cool air. Thomas counted them automatically, a habit ingrained by years of experience. All present and accounted for. No signs of illness or injury. The horses stood near the fence line, hoping for treats. Thomas obliged with a few apple slices from his pocket. He was loading hay into the truck when he first noticed the dust cloud on the distant road. Visitors were rare, and Thomas paused to watch the approaching vehicle. It was an old sedan, moving slowly and carefully up the gravel road that led to his house. As it drew closer, he could see it was filled with people, though the morning sun's glare made it difficult to make out details. The car came to a stop near his front porch, engine ticking as it cooled. Thomas set down the hay bale he'd been carrying and walked toward the vehicle, Rex at his heels. The dog's ears were perked with curiosity rather than alarm, which Thomas took as a good sign. The driver's door opened first, and a young Asian woman emerged. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were wrinkled and dusty, suggesting a long journey. She looked around nervously, taking in the vast landscape and the isolated ranch house with obvious uncertainty. The passenger door opened next, revealing another young Asian woman, this one slightly younger, perhaps 19 or 20. She moved more slowly, and Thomas noticed she was favoring her left leg as she stood. Both women appeared exhausted, their faces drawn with fatigue and something else, fear, perhaps, or desperation. Thomas stopped a respectful distance away, his hands visible and relaxed. Years of dealing with spooked livestock had taught him the value of calm, non-threatening body language. "Morning," he said simply, his voice carrying easily across the quiet morning air. The older woman stepped forward slightly, positioning herself protectively in front of her companion. "Please," she said, her English accented but clear, "we need help." Thomas studied them more carefully. Their clothes, while wrinkled, appeared to be good quality. Neither woman looked like they were accustomed to sleeping rough, yet there was dirt under their fingernails and dust in their hair. The younger woman was clearly in some kind of distress, though whether physical or emotional, Thomas couldn't tell. "What kind of help?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral but not unfriendly. The older woman glanced back at her companion, then met Thomas's eyes directly. There was intelligence there and determination, but also a deep weariness that spoke of troubles beyond simple car problems or getting lost. "My name is Li Wei," she said. "This is my sister, Li Mei. We are from China, and we are in very serious trouble. We have been driving for 3 days, and we saw your ranch from the main road. Please, we just need somewhere safe to stay for a little while." Thomas felt the first stirring of unease. His ranch was indeed visible from the main highway, though it was several miles off the beaten path. For someone to drive all the way out here, they would have had to be specifically looking for an isolated location. The question was why. "What kind of trouble?" he asked. Li Wei hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal to this stranger. "There are people looking for us. Bad people. We escaped from them, but they have resources and they will not stop searching." Thomas's mind immediately went to human trafficking, a problem he'd heard about on the news, but never encountered personally. The isolation that he treasured could make his ranch an ideal hiding place for people running from dangerous situations. But it could also make him a target if those dangerous people came looking. "Why don't you contact the police?" he suggested. The expression that crossed Li Wei's face was complex, part fear, part resignation, part bitter knowledge. "The police cannot help us with this," she said quietly. "Some of the people looking for us have connections with authorities. We cannot trust anyone in official positions." Thomas absorbed this information slowly. He prided himself on being a good judge of character, and these two young women didn't strike him as criminals or troublemakers. Their fears seemed genuine, and their desperation was evident in every line of their posture. But getting involved in whatever situation they were fleeing could bring exactly the kind of chaos and danger he'd spent years avoiding. Li Mei spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sir. We have nowhere else to go." Thomas looked at her more closely and noticed what he'd missed before. There were fading bruises on her wrists, barely visible beneath the long sleeves of her jacket. Her injured leg wasn't just fatigue, she was genuinely hurt. Whatever these young women had escaped from, it hadn't been pleasant. The rancher found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his day, but potentially the rest of his life. His instinct for self-preservation warred with a deeper impulse to help those in need. Sarah would have known what to do immediately. She'd have ushered them inside, fed them, and worried about consequences later. But Sarah was gone, and Thomas had grown comfortable making decisions that affected only himself. The morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily over the pasture. Thomas's cattle continued grazing, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the ranch house. Everything about this moment seemed ordinary except for the presence of two Chinese women asking for refuge on his isolated Montana ranch. Thomas realized that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would change everything about his carefully ordered, peaceful existence. The question was whether he was ready for that change, and whether he could live with himself if he turned them away. Thomas Mitchell stood in his kitchen, watching Li Wei help her injured sister settle into one of the wooden chairs around his dining table. The decision to bring them inside had been made when he'd seen Li Mei nearly collapse from exhaustion and pain. Whatever complications this might bring to his life, he couldn't leave an injured young woman standing in his yard. "Let me take a look at that leg," Thomas said, grabbing the first aid kit from the cabinet above the sink. He'd patched up enough injured animals over the years to have a decent understanding of basic medical care. Li Mei shook her head quickly, pressing herself back in the chair. "No, please. It is not serious." But Thomas had already noticed the way she couldn't put full weight on her left leg, and how she winced whenever she moved. "I'm not a doctor," he said gently, "but I've seen enough injuries to know when something needs attention. If you're going to stay here, even temporarily, I need to know you're not going to get worse on my watch." Li Wei translated quietly in what Thomas assumed was Mandarin. After a brief exchange between the sisters, Li Wei nodded. "She says you may look, but she is very frightened. The people who hurt us, they were not kind." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He'd suspected abuse, but hearing it confirmed stirred an anger he hadn't felt in years. He approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm just going to look at the leg, nothing more. If you need proper medical attention, we'll figure out how to get it safely." Li Mei's injury turned out to be a deep gash on her calf, partially healed but clearly infected. The wound had been crudely bandaged with what looked like torn fabric, and the surrounding skin was red and swollen. Thomas had seen similar injuries on cattle caught in barbed wire, and he knew this needed more than basic first aid. "This needs cleaning and proper bandaging," he told Li Wei. "Probably antibiotics, too." "How long has it been like this?" 5 days, Li Wei replied. "Since we escaped, we have been afraid to go to hospital because they might find us." Thomas considered their options. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away in town, and if these women were truly being hunted by people with resources and connections, a hospital visit would create records that could be traced. But leaving an infected wound untreated could lead to serious complications. "I've got some antibiotics in the veterinary supplies," he said finally. "They're meant for livestock, but they're the same medications doctors use for people. We could try that first, see if the infection responds. If it gets worse, we'll have to risk the hospital trip." While Thomas cleaned and properly bandaged Li Mei's wound, Li Wei told him more of their story. They had been students at a university in California, both studying computer science on student visas. Li Wei was working toward her master's degree, while Li Mei was in her second year of undergraduate studies. Their lives had been normal, even promising, until Li Mei had been approached by what she thought was a legitimate job opportunity. A man came to campus, Li Wei explained, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. He said he represented a technology company that hired international students. He offered Li Mei a very good salary, housing, even help with her visa status. She was excited because our family in China has struggled financially, and this job would allow her to send money home. Thomas finished bandaging the wound and gave Li Mei a dose of antibiotics. The young woman had remained silent during the medical treatment, but he could see tears sliding down her cheeks as her sister continued their story. "The job was not what they promised," Li Wei continued. "They took Li Mei to a house with many other young women, all from different countries. They took her passport, her phone, her identification. They said she owed them money for transportation and housing, and she would have to work to pay it back." Thomas felt his stomach turn as the implications became clear. "What kind of work?" Li Wei's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The kind that no woman should be forced to do. They threatened to have her deported if she refused, said they would tell immigration authorities she was working illegally. When she tried to resist, they hurt her to show they were serious." Thomas returned to his chair, processing this information. He'd heard about human trafficking operations, but like most people in rural areas, he'd assumed it was primarily an urban problem. The idea that such operations could reach into universities targeting vulnerable students brought the horror much closer to home. "How did you find out what happened to her?" he asked. Li Mei managed to call me once, very briefly, before they took her phone away. She could not say much, but she told me the address of where they were keeping her. I went there, but the house looked normal from outside. I called police, but when they investigated, the house appeared empty. Later, I learned that these people have ways of hiding their operations quickly when authorities come. Li Wei had spent weeks trying to work through official channels, contacting immigration services, local police, even the Chinese consulate. But every lead seemed to disappear, and she began to suspect that the organization behind Li Mei's trafficking had more resources and connections than a desperate sister could overcome. I started watching the house at different times, Li Wei continued, learning their patterns. I saw that they moved the women frequently, probably to different locations, but they always came back to this one house. I waited for an opportunity. That opportunity had come 5 nights earlier, when a fire in the neighborhood had created enough chaos and distraction for Li Wei to break into the house through a basement window. She found Li Mei and 3 other women locked in rooms upstairs, all in various states of injury and malnutrition. I could only take Li Mei, Li Wei said, her voice heavy with guilt. The others begged me to help them too, but I could not carry more than one person, and Li Mei was badly hurt. I promised them I would come back with help, but now I do not know how to keep that promise. Thomas listened to this with growing horror and admiration. Li Wei, probably no more than 23 years old, had single-handedly infiltrated a human trafficking operation and rescued her sister. The courage that must have required was staggering, as was the guilt she now carried for leaving other victims behind. What happened after you got her out? We stole a car from the neighborhood, Li Wei admitted. I know it was wrong, but we had no choice. Li Mei could barely walk, and I knew they would discover she was missing soon. We drove through the night, avoiding highways when we could. They have been following us since. This revelation made Thomas's blood run cold. Following you? How do you know? We have seen the same vehicles several times, staying far back, but always there. Yesterday morning, when we stopped for gas in a small town in Idaho, Li Mei saw one of the men who had been guarding her at the house. We ran, left the stolen car, and took another one. But they're still looking. Thomas walked to his front window and scanned the horizon. The long gravel road that led to his ranch was empty, and he could see for miles in every direction. If someone was following these women, his isolated location might provide temporary safety, but it could also become a trap if they were discovered here. Why did you come all the way to Montana? He asked. We remembered something from our geography classes about how sparse the population is here, Li Wei explained. We thought maybe we could hide in a place where there are not many people, where strangers would be noticed if they came looking. When we saw your ranch from the highway, it looked peaceful and isolated. We hoped maybe you would be kind. Thomas felt the weight of their trust settling on his shoulders. These 2 young women had placed their lives in his hands based on nothing more than hope and desperation. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the injustice of their situation. He thought about his comfortable, predictable life just a few hours earlier. His biggest concerns had been checking the heating system in the barn and planning his weekly trip to town for supplies. Now he was harboring fugitives from a human trafficking ring, treating infected wounds with veterinary antibiotics, and trying to figure out how to keep 2 young women safe from people who clearly had significant resources and no qualms about violence. You said they have connections with authorities, Thomas said. What kind of connections? Li Wei looked uncomfortable. We're not certain, but when I tried to report Li Mei missing, the police seemed to know things about our family in China that we had never told them. They asked questions about our visa status, our finances, our contacts in America. It felt like they were investigating us instead of helping us find Li Mei. This suggested the trafficking operation had either infiltrated law enforcement or had access to government databases. Either possibility made involving official authorities extremely risky. Thomas found himself in a situation where his natural inclination to follow proper legal channels could actually endanger the people he was trying to help. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the kitchen windows when Li Mei spoke up for the first time in over an hour. Mr. Thomas, she said softly, we do not want to bring danger to you. If staying here puts you at risk, we will leave. We're grateful for the medicine and bandages. Thomas studied her face. Despite everything she'd been through, there was dignity in her bearing and genuine concern for his well-being. These weren't criminals or opportunists. They were innocent young women caught in a nightmare not of their making. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not while you're injured, and not while there are dangerous people looking for you. But we need to be smart about this. If they are following you, we need to make sure this place doesn't stand out as suspicious. Thomas began formulating a plan. The ranch's isolation was both an advantage and a vulnerability. It would be difficult for outsiders to approach without being seen, but if they did locate the women here, escape options would be limited. He needed to prepare for both possibilities. First thing, he said, we need to hide that car you came in. My barn has space, and from the air or from a distance, it won't be visible. Second, we need to establish some kind of communication system in case we get separated. Third, I need to understand exactly who we're dealing with and what resources they have. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself adapting to circumstances he'd never imagined facing. He moved the sister's car into the barn, parking it behind farm equipment where it would be hidden from casual view. He showed them the layout of the ranch house and barn, including exits and hiding places. Most importantly, he began to understand the scope of the criminal organization they were fleeing from. Li Wei had managed to learn quite a bit during her weeks of investigation. The trafficking ring appeared to operate across multiple states, targeting international students and young immigrants. They used legitimate-seeming businesses as fronts, had connections within various bureaucratic systems, and employed both psychological manipulation and physical force to control their victims. As evening approached, Thomas realized his quiet life of routine and solitude had ended, perhaps permanently. Whatever happened next, he was now committed to protecting these two young women, even if it meant confronting dangers he'd spent his entire life avoiding. The golden light of sunset painted the ranch in familiar colors, but everything else about Thomas's world had fundamentally changed. In the distance, his cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their owner had just committed himself to a fight against forces he didn't fully understand, armed with nothing more than determination and the conviction that some things were worth the risk. 3 days had passed since Li Wei and Li Mei arrived at the ranch, and Thomas Mitchell was beginning to understand how dramatically his life had changed. The women had settled into a routine of sorts, with Li Wei helping around the house, and Li Mei resting while her leg continued to heal. The antibiotics were working, and the infection was beginning to clear, but the deeper wounds would take much longer to heal. Thomas had moved the sisters into Sarah's old sewing room on the second floor, which had a good view of the approach road, and was close to the back staircase that led to a door near the barn. If they needed to escape quickly, this room offered the best options. He'd also given them one of his extra walkie-talkies, set to a frequency he used for ranch operations. The morning of the fourth day brought the first test of their security measures. Thomas was in the barn, checking on the cattle feed supplies, when Rex began barking frantically from the yard. The dog's alarm bark was different from his normal alert signals, and Thomas immediately grabbed his binoculars and climbed to the barn's loft window. A dark SUV was coming up the road, moving slowly and deliberately. It stopped about a quarter mile from the house, well within sight, but far enough away to observe without committing to an approach. Thomas could see two figures in the front seats, and the vehicle had license plates he didn't recognize. He keyed his walkie-talkie. Li Wei, this is Thomas. We have visitors. Get to the hiding spot we discussed, and stay quiet until I give you the all-clear. Understood, came her immediate response. They had rehearsed this scenario several times over the past few days. Thomas climbed down from the loft and walked casually toward the house, trying to project the image of a rancher going about his normal business. But his mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies. If these are the people hunting Li Wei and Li Mei, how had they tracked them here? Had they been followed despite all precautions, or had someone talked? The SUV remained stationary for nearly 20 minutes before beginning to approach the house again. Thomas positioned himself on the front porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, and his posture relaxed despite the tension coiling in his muscles. Rex sat beside him, no longer barking, but alert and watchful. The SUV pulled into the yard, and two men emerged. They were dressed casually, but expensively, with the kind of clothes that looked comfortable, but cost more than most ranchers spend on clothing in a year. Both were Asian, probably in their 30s, and carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. Good morning, the taller of the two called out as they approached the porch. His English was accented, but fluent. We are looking for two young women who may have come through this area recently. We thought perhaps you might have seen them. Thomas took a sip of his coffee before responding. Don't get many visitors out here. What makes you think they came this way? We have reason to believe they were traveling north through Montana, the shorter man said. He produced a photograph from his jacket pocket. These are the women we're looking for. They're in serious trouble with immigration authorities, and we've been hired to help locate them before they get themselves into even worse legal difficulties. Thomas glanced at the photograph without taking it. It was indeed a picture of Li Wei and Li Mei, probably taken from university records or social media. The story about immigration troubles was smoothly delivered and might have been convincing to someone who didn't know the real situation. Can't say I've seen them, Thomas replied honestly. He technically hadn't seen them when this photograph was taken. Like I said, we don't get many visitors out here. Folks traveling through usually stick to the main highway. The taller man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, we understand these rural areas can be quite isolated. Perhaps they stopped to ask for directions, or maybe sought shelter if their vehicle broke down. Nope. If someone had come asking for help, I'd remember. Not much happens out here to forget. Thomas maintained eye contact, projecting the calm confidence of someone with nothing to hide. May we ask your name? The shorter man inquired. Thomas Mitchell. I own this ranch. Mr. Mitchell, we appreciate your time. If you don't mind, we'd like to leave you our contact information in case these women do show up. As we mentioned, they're in quite serious legal trouble, and the sooner we can locate them, the better it will be for everyone involved. One of the men handed Thomas a business card. It looked legitimate, with a company name Thomas didn't recognize and a phone number with a Seattle area code. He glanced at it briefly before tucking it into his shirt pocket. I'll keep an eye out, Thomas said. But, like I told you, this is pretty far off the beaten path for folks just passing through. The men thanked him and returned to their SUV, but Thomas noticed they didn't leave immediately. Instead, they drove slowly around the circular drive that led past the barn, ostensibly turning around, but clearly observing the ranch layout. They paused near the barn for several moments before finally heading back down the road. Thomas remained on the porch until the vehicle disappeared from sight, then waited another 10 minutes before keying his radio. All clear. They're gone for now, but we need to talk. Li Wei and Li Mei emerged from their hiding place in the root cellar beneath the barn, where Thomas had prepared a concealed space behind stored feed sacks. Both women looked shaken, and Li Mei was trembling visibly. Did you see them clearly? Thomas asked Li Wei. She nodded grimly. The shorter one was at the house where they kept Li Mei. His name is Chun. I did not know the other one, but if Chun is here, then the organization knows we are in this area. This confirmation sent a chill through Thomas. The men had been professional and polite, but knowing they were directly connected to Li Mei's captors changed everything. These weren't just investigators or bounty hunters. They were part of the criminal organization itself. How could they have tracked you here? Thomas asked. Li Wei shook her head. We were very careful. We avoided main roads when possible, paid cash for everything, stayed away from places with security cameras. But they have resources we may not understand. Thomas examined the business card the men had left. The company name was Pacific Consulting Services, and a quick check on his phone showed it had a basic website listing immigration and legal services. It looked legitimate on the surface, which suggested these people were sophisticated enough to maintain convincing cover identities. We need to assume they'll be back, Thomas said. They're clearly searching the area systematically, and this ranch is isolated enough that they might decide it's worth investigating more thoroughly. The rest of the day was spent preparing for that possibility. Thomas and Li Wei worked together to create better hiding places, including a concealed space in the barn's loft and an emergency cache of supplies in the old storm cellar. They also developed communication protocols and escape routes that would work in different scenarios. As evening approached, Thomas found himself facing a decision he'd been avoiding. His involvement up to this point could be explained as simple humanitarian assistance to injured strangers. But if the trafficking organization suspected he was hiding their targets, continuing to harbor Li Wei, and Li Mei would put him directly in conflict with dangerous criminals. The smart thing would be to help the sisters leave the ranch that night, perhaps drive them to another state, or put them on a bus to somewhere far away. But Thomas had seen Li Mei's injuries and heard enough of their story to know that turning them out would likely be sending them to their deaths. During dinner, Li Wei brought up the subject that had been weighing on all their minds. Mr. Thomas, We know our being here puts you in danger. We have been thinking that perhaps we should leave tonight, try to get farther away before they come back. Where would you go? Thomas asked. You have no resources, no safe contacts, and Li Mei is still recovering from her injuries. If these people found you once, what makes you think they won't find you again? We cannot ask you to risk your life for us, Li Mei said quietly. It was the most she'd spoken since arriving at the ranch. You have been so kind, but this is not your fight. Thomas set down his fork and looked at both women seriously. The way I see it, this became my fight the moment I let you into my house. I'm not in the habit of starting things I don't intend to finish. But even as he said those words, Thomas knew they were facing a situation that was beyond his experience and capabilities. He was a rancher, not a law enforcement officer or a security expert. He had hunting rifles and farm equipment, not the resources to fight a criminal organization with connections and unlimited funding. There might be another option, Li Wei said hesitantly. Before Li Mei was taken, she was working with a professor at the university who specializes in international human rights law, Dr. Sarah Chun. She has connections with federal agencies that investigate trafficking. Why haven't you contacted her already? We were afraid, Li Wei admitted. If the traffickers have people in local law enforcement, maybe they have connections in federal agencies too. And we were not sure Dr. Chan would believe our story or risk her career to help us. Thomas considered this possibility. Federal involvement could provide the protection and resources they needed, but it would also mean revealing everything and hoping that the right people could be trusted. It was a significant gamble, but their current situation was unsustainable. Do you have a way to contact this professor safely? He asked. Li Wei nodded. She gave him her personal email address and said she could be contacted day or night if there were ever problems. But we would need secure internet access, and we would have to be very careful about how we approach her. How about satellite internet? Thomas said. It's not the fastest, but it should be secure enough for email. The question is whether we can trust this professor to handle the information properly. As they discussed their options, Thomas realized he was committed to seeing this through regardless of the personal cost. Sarah would have done the same thing without hesitation, and her memory demanded nothing less from him. The trafficking organization had made a crucial error in bringing their criminal enterprise to his doorstep. They had transformed him from an uninvolved bystander to a very motivated adversary. The evening sky was clear and filled with stars as Thomas stepped onto his porch after dinner. The same view that had brought him peace for decades now seemed to hold potential threats in every shadow. But along with the fear and uncertainty, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own comfort and security. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the men who had visited that morning would likely return with more resources and less patience. But tonight, Li Wei and Li Mei were safe, fed, and beginning to heal from their ordeal. For the first time since their escape, they had an ally with the determination and resources to fight back. Thomas had spent 4 years learning to live alone after Sarah's death, finding contentment in solitude and routine. Now, he was discovering that some things were worth breaking that routine for, worth risking that solitude to protect. As he headed inside to help Li Wei compose an email to Dr. Chun, he felt more alive and engaged than he had since his wife's funeral. The quiet rancher who had awakened that morning was gone, replaced by someone willing to stand between innocent victims and the criminals who would exploit them. There was no going back to his former life, but Thomas was beginning to realize he wouldn't want to even if he could. Dr. Sarah Chin's response came faster than Thomas had expected. Li Wei had sent the email at midnight using Thomas's satellite internet connection, carefully explaining their situation and pleading for help. By 6 in the morning, there was a reply waiting, and its contents changed everything about their desperate circumstances. Thank you for trusting me with this information. Dr. Chun had written, Li Mei mentioned you in our conversations, and I've been extremely worried since she disappeared from campus. What you're describing matches intelligence that federal authorities have been developing about a trafficking operation in the Pacific Northwest. I'm forwarding your email to Special Agent Maria Santos with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Agent Santos has been investigating this organization for over a year and can provide the protection and resources you need. She will contact you within 24 hours using the secure communication method I'm including with this message. Stay safe and know that help is coming. The email included detailed instructions for setting up an encrypted communication channel that would allow them to speak with federal agents without risking interception. Thomas spent the morning following Dr. Chen's technical directions, grateful for Li Wei's computer skills when his own knowledge proved insufficient. By afternoon, they were in contact with Agent Santos, a 20-year FBI veteran who specialized in transnational criminal organizations. Her first message was both reassuring and sobering. Your information correlates with an ongoing federal investigation into a trafficking network we've been tracking across multiple states. You are all in immediate danger, but you've also provided us with the breakthrough we've been looking for. We need to extract you safely and get Li Mei's testimony on record, but we must do this carefully to avoid compromising the larger investigation. Agent Santos explained that the organization Li Wei and Li Mei had escaped from was part of a much larger criminal network with connections across the Pacific Rim. They trafficked not just people, but also drugs and weapons, using their legitimate business fronts to move money and resources internationally. The FBI had been working with international partners to map the organization's structure, but they'd lacked direct testimony from victims who could provide detailed intelligence about the operation's inner workings. Li Mei's information about the house where she was held could be the key to rescuing other victims and dismantling this network, Agent Santos explained during their first secure video call that evening. But we need to be extremely careful. These people have significant resources, including technical capabilities that allow them to monitor communications and track financial transactions. Thomas found himself thrust into the middle of an international criminal investigation that made his rural Montana ranch feel like the center of a spy novel. Agent Santos walked them through security protocols that seemed surreal in the context of his simple rancher's life, but were apparently necessary given the sophistication of their adversaries. The men who visited your ranch yesterday are already on our radar, Agent Santos continued. Chun Wei-Ming, the shorter one you identified, is a mid-level operative in the organization. His presence in Montana means they're taking this escape very seriously. We believe they've assigned significant resources to recapturing Li Wei and Li Mei. This news was both reassuring and terrifying. Knowing that federal agents were aware of their situation provided hope, but learning that their pursuers were part of an international criminal organization elevated the danger to levels Thomas had never imagined. What's the plan for getting them to safety? Thomas asked. We're working on that, Agent Santos replied. The challenge is that we can't simply extract them without compromising our investigation. We need Li Mei's testimony, but we also need to use this situation to gather intelligence that will help us rescue other victims and arrest the organization's leadership. Agent Santos proposed a plan that was both bold and risky. Instead of immediately moving Li Wei and Li Mei to safety, she wanted to use the ranch as a controlled environment to gather intelligence on the trafficking network. FBI agents would establish surveillance positions around the property, monitoring for the return of Chun and his associates while using sophisticated electronic equipment to intercept their communications. We believe they'll come back, Agent Santos explained, probably with more people and more resources. When they do, we'll be ready to follow them back to their base of operations and gather evidence about their structure and methods. Thomas felt his stomach tighten at the implications. You're talking about using us as bait. In a sense, yes, Agent Santos admitted. But you'll be protected by a full tactical team, and this could be our only chance to locate the other victims Li Wei mentioned. Every day we delay means more young women suffering what Li Mei endured. The weight of this decision fell heavily on Thomas's shoulders. He could insist on immediate extraction for Li Wei and Li Mei, ensuring their safety, but potentially condemning other victims to continued captivity. Or he could agree to the FBI's plan, accepting significant risk in the hope of striking a meaningful blow against the trafficking network. Li Wei and Li Mei, when consulted about the plan, surprised Thomas with their immediate agreement to proceed. Those other women begged me to come back for them, Li Wei said quietly. If there's a chance to help them, we must take it. Li Mei, despite everything she'd endured, showed remarkable courage in agreeing to the plan. I was lucky that Li Wei could rescue me, she said. The other girls do not have sisters looking for them. If my testimony can help free them, then the risk is worth taking. Their bravery humbled Thomas, and solidified his commitment to seeing the operation through. If these two young women could face their tormentors again in the hope of helping other victims, then he could certainly provide the support they needed. Agent Santos's team began arriving the next day, but not in ways Thomas had expected. Instead of obvious federal vehicles and uniformed agents, the FBI personnel arrived disguised as various service workers and contractors. A telephone repair crew established communications equipment in the barn. Fence maintenance workers installed sophisticated surveillance gear along the ranch's perimeter. A propane delivery truck brought tactical equipment that was concealed in the storm cellar. Thomas found himself working with people whose real names he didn't know, communicating through code words and hand signals that would have seemed absurd a week earlier. His ranch was transformed into a sophisticated intelligence gathering operation while maintaining the appearance of a working cattle operation. The preparation took 3 days, during which Thomas learned more about modern surveillance and law enforcement techniques than he'd ever wanted to know. Hidden cameras covered every approach to the ranch house. Electronic listening devices monitored radio frequencies the trafficking organization was known to use. Motion sensors detected any movement along the access road from miles away. Throughout this preparation, Li Wei and Li Mei remained remarkably calm. Li Wei spent time learning to use the communication equipment that would allow her to relay real-time intelligence to the FBI team. Li Mei worked with Agent Santos via secure video link, providing detailed information about the layout of the house where she'd been held and the routines of her captors. Thomas was amazed by Li Mei's strength and attention to detail as she recounted her ordeal. Despite the trauma she'd endured, she provided precise information about guard rotations, the location of other captives, and the organizational structure of the trafficking operation as she'd observed it. Her testimony was building a comprehensive picture that would guide the FBI's broader investigation. On the 4th day after Agent Santos's first contact, the waiting ended. Motion sensors detected vehicles approaching the ranch at dawn, moving slowly and carefully up the access road. Thomas was in the barn, ostensibly checking on his cattle, but actually monitoring the FBI's communication center when the alert came through. Multiple vehicles approaching, came the whispered report from an agent positioned a mile down the road. Black SUV and white van, both with tinted windows. 6 individuals visible, probably more in the van. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he realized the confrontation they'd been preparing for was finally at hand. Through his earpiece, he could hear Agent Santos coordinating with tactical teams positioned around the ranch perimeter. Li Wei and Li Mei were secured in the reinforced safe room that had been constructed in the storm cellar, with a direct communication line to the command post. The vehicle stopped at the same observation point Chun had used during his previous visit, but this time they didn't approach immediately. Instead, they remained stationary for over an hour, undoubtedly studying the ranch through binoculars or telescopes, looking for any signs of law enforcement presence or unusual activity. They're being very careful, Agent Santos observed through the communication system. This suggests they suspect something, or they're just being professionally cautious. Either way, we need to be ready for anything. Thomas positioned himself on the front porch with a cup of coffee, just as he had during Chen's previous visit. To any observer, he would appear to be a rancher taking a morning break, but the casual pose concealed sophisticated communication equipment and body armor hidden beneath his jacket. When the vehicles finally approached the ranch house, Thomas could see that the trafficking organization had escalated their response significantly. 6 men emerged from the 2 vehicles, all dressed in dark clothing and moving with military precision. Chun was among them, but he was clearly no longer in charge. A tall, well-dressed man who appeared to be in his 40s took the lead, flanked by 2 others who looked like professional security personnel. "Mr. Mitchell," the man called out as they approached the porch. His accent was less pronounced than Chen's, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority. "My name is David Wong. We spoke with you several days ago about 2 missing young women." Thomas recognized the subtle shift in their story. During the previous visit, they had claimed to be helping with immigration problems. Now, they were claiming to have spoken with him directly, testing whether he would maintain his story or reveal inconsistencies. "I remember," Thomas replied calmly. "Like I told your associates, I haven't seen anyone matching those descriptions." Wong smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Mitchell, we have reason to believe those women may have approached your ranch seeking assistance. We're prepared to offer a substantial reward for information about their whereabouts. How substantial? Thomas asked, playing the role of a financially motivated rancher. $50,000. Wong replied without hesitation. Cash, no questions asked, just for information about where they might have gone. The offer confirmed that Li Wei and Li Mei were extremely valuable to the trafficking organization, probably worth much more than $50,000 to recapture. Thomas wondered how many other victims they'd been willing to pay similar amounts to retrieve. That's a lot of money, Thomas said thoughtfully. Makes a man wonder why you're so interested in finding them. Wong's expression hardened slightly. They stole property belonging to my employer and violated the terms of their employment contract. We need to recover that property and ensure they fulfill their legal obligations. The euphemisms were chilling in their casual delivery. Thomas realized he was speaking with someone who viewed human beings as property to be bought, sold, and recovered when they escaped. The evil behind the professional demeanor was absolute and uncompromising. Well, Thomas said after a moment, 50,000 is certainly enough to get a man's attention. If I hear anything about these women, I'll be sure to contact you. Wong studied Thomas's face carefully, clearly trying to determine whether the rancher was being truthful or playing a more complex game. After a long moment, he nodded to his companions, and they began walking back toward their vehicles. But instead of leaving, they started a systematic inspection of the ranch property, examining the barn, the outbuildings, and the surrounding areas. Thomas realized they weren't going to be satisfied with his denials this time. They intended to search the property thoroughly, and if they found any evidence of Li Wei and Li Mei's presence, the carefully planned FBI operation would become a firefight. Through his earpiece, Thomas heard Agent Santos giving quiet orders to her tactical teams. The moment of truth had arrived, and everything they'd prepared for was about to be put to the test. As Wong's men spread out across his property, Thomas remained on the porch, projecting calm, while his heart raced with the knowledge that multiple lives hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Wong himself remained near the vehicles, speaking quietly into a phone while his men spread out across the ranch. Two headed toward the barn, while another pair began examining the house's exterior, looking for signs of recent occupancy or disturbance. Chun took the lead on the barn search, his familiarity with Li Mei making him particularly dangerous if he discovered evidence of her presence. Thomas forced himself to remain casual, sitting down on his porch steps as if watching the search with curious detachment. You fellows are mighty thorough, he called out to Wong. Hope you don't mind me asking what you expect to find out here. Just being careful, Mr. Mitchell, Wong replied without taking his attention off his phone conversation. These women are dangerous fugitives, and we need to be certain they haven't compromised innocent ranchers like yourself. The casual way Wong delivered this lie, while his men violated Thomas's property rights, revealed everything about the organization's methods. They operated with complete confidence that their resources and connections would protect them from any consequences, treating law-abiding citizens as obstacles to be manipulated or eliminated as necessary. From the barn came Chen's voice, speaking rapidly in what Thomas assumed was Mandarin. Wong's expression sharpened, and he began walking quickly toward the sound. Through his earpiece, Thomas heard Agent Santos's voice. They've found something in the barn. All units prepare for immediate intervention. Thomas's heart sank as he realized what Chun had likely discovered. Despite all their precautions, there must have been some trace evidence of Li Wei and Li Mei's presence that the FBI hadn't anticipated. He stood up slowly, trying to project confusion rather than the fear that was coursing through his system. Wong emerged from the barn with Chun and the other searcher, his face transformed from professional courtesy to cold menace. In his hand was a piece of fabric that Thomas recognized as part of the makeshift bandages Li Wei had used to treat her sister's wound before Thomas had provided proper medical supplies. Mr. Mitchell, Wong said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. It appears you haven't been entirely truthful with us. Thomas shrugged, buying time, while Agent Santos's teams moved into position. Can't say I know what that is or how it got there. Lots of folks have used my barn over the years for shelter or repairs. This fabric contains blood, and it's been here recently. Wong continued, moving closer to the porch. The blood type matches one of our missing employees. We also found tire tracks that don't match your vehicles. The professional facade was completely gone now, replaced by the calculating menace of a predator who had cornered his prey. Wong's men had repositioned themselves to control the approaches to the house, and Thomas realized they were preparing for violence, if necessary. "I think it's time you told us the truth about what happened here," Wong said, pulling a pistol from beneath his jacket. "Where are Li Wei and Li Mei?" Thomas raised his hands slowly, maintaining eye contact with Wong while listening for Agent Santos' signal. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "But if you think threatening me on my own property is going to get you anywhere, you're badly mistaken." Wong smiled coldly. "Mr. Mitchell, you have no idea who you're dealing with. My organization has resources and connections that extend far beyond rural Montana. If you're protecting those women, you're making a mistake that will cost you everything." The threat was delivered with absolute conviction, and Thomas realized this was a man who had made similar threats many times before and followed through on them. Wong's organization didn't just traffic in human beings. They eliminated obstacles and witnesses with the same business-like efficiency they brought to their other criminal activities. "Last chance, Mr. Mitchell," Wong said, raising his weapon. "Tell us where they are, and you'll be compensated for your cooperation. Continue lying to us, and things will become very unpleasant for everyone involved." Thomas was about to respond when Agent Santos's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Go, go, go. Federal agents, drop your weapons." The FBI tactical teams emerged from concealment with devastating coordination. Agents appeared from behind the barn, from positions near the house, and from vehicles that had been hidden beyond the ridge line. Within seconds, Wong and his men found themselves surrounded by federal agents in full tactical gear, with automatic weapons trained on them from multiple angles. "FBI, drop your weapons and get on the ground immediately." Agent Santos's voice boomed across the ranch yard through a megaphone. "This property is under federal protection." Wong's expression transformed from confident menace to shocked disbelief as he realized the scope of the operation that had been waiting for him. For a moment, Thomas thought the trafficker might try to fight his way out, but the overwhelming superiority of the federal response made resistance pointless. One by one, Wong's men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Wong himself held his pistol for several seconds longer, his eyes darting around the ranch as if calculating escape routes, before finally placing it on the ground and assuming the position demanded by the federal agents. "David Wong, also known as Wong Dawei, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, and numerous federal crimes," Agent Santos announced as tactical officers secured the suspects. "You have the right to remain silent." Thomas found himself shaking as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. The quiet ranch that had been his sanctuary for decades had just been the site of a federal law enforcement operation that would likely make national news. More importantly, the nightmare that had begun when two desperate young women appeared at his door was finally coming to an end. Agent Santos approached the porch, removing her tactical helmet to reveal a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Mitchell, are you injured?" "No, I'm fine," Thomas replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Are Li Wei and Li Mei safe?" "They're secure in the safe room. My teams will extract them as soon as we've processed this crime scene." Agent Santos studied Thomas's face carefully. "What you've done here took tremendous courage. Without your willingness to help those women and cooperate with our investigation, we never could have achieved this breakthrough." As the federal agents processed the arrested traffickers and secured evidence from their vehicles, Agent Santos explained the broader implications of the operation's success. Wong was a high-ranking member of the trafficking organization, and his capture would provide intelligence about the network structure and operations across multiple countries. The evidence gathered from his phone and the contents of the van would help authorities rescue other victims and disrupt the organization's activities. "Chen has already started talking," Agent Santos reported. "He's providing information about the house where Li Mei was held, and we're coordinating with local authorities to raid that location within the hour. Thanks to Li Mei's detailed descriptions, we know exactly where to look for the other victims." This news brought Thomas more satisfaction than all the arrests and seizures combined. The young women Li Wei had been forced to leave behind would soon be free, and the house of horrors that had traumatized Li Mei would be shut down permanently. As evening approached, Thomas found himself sitting on his porch with Li Wei and Li Mei, watching federal agents finish processing the crime scene. The sisters were both visibly relieved, but also emotionally exhausted by the day's events. Li Mei's leg had healed enough for her to walk without assistance, but Thomas could see that her psychological recovery would take much longer. What happens now? Li Wei asked Agent Santos as she prepared to leave with her prisoners and evidence. You'll both be placed in witness protection until the trials are complete, Agent Santos explained. Given the international scope of this organization, the legal proceedings could take several years. But you'll be safe, and you'll have access to counseling and educational support to help you rebuild your lives. Li Mei looked toward Thomas with tears in her eyes. Mr. Thomas, we can never repay what you have done for us. You saved our lives and helped us save others. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone should do when innocent people need help. But even as he said those words, Thomas knew they weren't entirely true. Most people, faced with the choice between safety and risk, would have chosen safety. Most people would have called the police and walked away, leaving Li Wei and Li Mei to face their fate alone. Thomas had made a different choice, and that choice had changed not just their lives, but his own. Agent Santos left contact information and assurances that Thomas would be kept informed about the progress of the investigation and trials. The federal government would also provide security monitoring for his ranch, since there was always the possibility that other members of the trafficking organization might seek revenge against the man who had helped bring down their operation. As the last federal vehicle disappeared down the road, Thomas found himself alone on his ranch for the first time in over a week. The silence that had once brought him peace now felt strange and empty after the intensity of recent events. Rex sat beside him on the porch, sensing his master's mood and offering silent companionship. Thomas thought about Sarah and how proud she would have been of his decision to help Li Wei and Li Mei. She had always believed that people should stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. In protecting those two young women, Thomas had honored her memory in a way that went beyond simply maintaining their ranch or preserving their shared routines. The phone rang inside the house, and Thomas rose to answer it. The voice on the other end was his son Michael, calling from Seattle with excitement and pride evident in his tone. Dad, I just saw the news report about what happened at the ranch. Are you okay? They're saying you helped the FBI break up an international human trafficking ring. Thomas smiled, realizing that his quiet life of rural isolation was about to become much more public. I'm fine, Michael. Just did what needed doing. Dad, what you did was incredible. Mom would have been so proud. She would have done the same thing, Thomas replied. Probably would have figured out how to do it better and faster than I managed. They talked for nearly an hour, with Michael expressing amazement at his father's courage and determination. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of connection and purpose that extended beyond the boundaries of his ranch. After ending the call, Thomas returned to his porch to watch the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. Tomorrow would bring reporters, investigators, and probably more disruption to his peaceful routine. But tonight, he could sit quietly with the knowledge that Li Wei and Li Mei were safe, that other victims had been rescued, and that a criminal organization that had caused immeasurable suffering had been dealt a decisive blow. The rancher who had awakened a week ago to a quiet, predictable life was gone forever. In his place sat a man who had discovered that some things were worth any risk, and that the greatest peace came not from avoiding the world's troubles, but from standing up to them when they appeared at your door. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Thomas Mitchell felt more at home in his own life than he had since Sarah's death. The quiet peace he had cultivated through 4 years of solitude had been transformed into something deeper and more meaningful. The peace that comes from knowing you've done what was right, regardless of the cost. The ranch would always be his sanctuary, but it would never again be his hiding place. He had learned that true peace came not from isolation, but from the courage to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And in that knowledge, Thomas found a contentment that would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead.